The year was 1766. The air in Virginia hung thick with tension. The colonies were restless, simmering with anger at taxes, corrupt officials, and the arrogance of those who use power for personal gain. The British Crown had just enforced the Stamp Act, and with it came resentment that burned hotter than summer tar. Dr. William Deering, once a respected man, would soon find himself at the center of that fire. He was not a politician or a soldier. He was a physician, educated, polished, and confident, but to the people of his town, he represented something worse than tyranny, betrayal from within. Accusations spread that Deering had overcharged, cheated, and used his position to exploit those already crushed by unfair taxes. Whether the charges were true or exaggerated by rage hardly mattered. In the eyes of the mob, guilt had already been decided. That night, the streets filled with men carrying torches. Their faces, half lit by flame, were twisted not just by hatred, but by righteous fury. They called themselves patriots, defenders of justice. Yet what they were about to do had little to do with justice and everything to do with vengeance. Drive Deering's home stood at the edge of town. Inside, he was said to be preparing to leave Virginia, perhaps to escape his growing enemies. But it was too late. The crowd broke down the door with shouts that echoed into the dark fields beyond. They dragged him out, half-dressed, terrified, pleading to reason with them. The torches flickered over buckets of tar, heating in an iron pot. The smell was overpowering, thick and acrid, mingling with the humid night air. Feathers were piled nearby, goose feathers, gathered from farms, now symbols of humiliation. Someone shouted, "Strip him." The crowd roared in approval. Deering's clothes were ripped from his body, leaving him exposed under the torchlight. His skin gleamed with sweat and fear. He begged them to stop, to listen, but his words were drowned by the chants of justice. Justice! The tar boiled, bubbling and popping like a cauldron. Two men dipped wooden ladles into the pot and stepped forward. Deering saw it then, realized, too late, what was coming. The first splash of molten tar hit his chest, and the scream that followed cut through the noise like a blade. The crowd didn't stop. They poured more, across his shoulders, down his arms, over his legs. His skin blistered instantly. The smell of burning flesh rose with the smoke. He fell to his knees, convulsing, hands clawing at the air. And then came the feathers. They stuck to his body, clinging to the tar, turning him into a grotesque parody of a bird, a symbol of scorn and mockery. The men laughed, some drunkenly, others with a grim sense of duty. They called him Dr. Bird, jeering as they forced him to his feet. They made him walk, barefoot, bleeding, coated in tar and feathers, through the main street. Every step toward his burned flesh. Children threw stones. Women watched from windows, some weeping, others silent. This was no ordinary punishment. It was theater, a message written in agony. The crowd wanted everyone to see what happened to those who took advantage of the people. They wanted to make him an example. By dawn, what had started as a mob had turned into a procession of cruelty. Deering stumbled, collapsed, and was dragged again, his body trembling uncontrollably. The tar had hardened in places, cracking his skin whenever he moved. He could barely open his eyes through the mixture of sweat, soot, and pain. When they finally released him, he was unrecognizable. The once proud doctor crawled into the shadows of his own town, a man stripped not just of his dignity, but of his humanity. His wounds would scar, his reputation would rot, but his name would live on, as the man who suffered under one of America's earliest and most brutal public punishments. Tar and feathering was not new to the world, but in colonial America, it became something more than torture. It became ritual, a violent performance meant to unite communities through shared outrage. To some, it was justice without law. To others, it was mob rule wearing the mask of morality. Over the next decade, it spread, from Boston to the Carolinas, tax collectors, smugglers, informers, and anyone accused of siding with Britain faced the same fate. Some died from burns or infections. Others lived, but carried the scars for life. What began as a punishment for corruption soon became a weapon of rebellion. Colonial mobs used it to challenge imperial power, to humiliate British loyalists, to show that they no longer feared authority. But in that transformation, something dark revealed itself: the willingness of ordinary people to become executioners in the name of freedom. For Dr. Deering, there was no redemption. Records suggest he fled Virginia not long after. His body maimed and his name ruined, he became a ghost of the Revolution, a warning of what could happen when anger replaced justice. Yet his story raises a haunting question: where does punishment end and cruelty begin? When the colonists tarred and feathered their enemies, they believed they were defending liberty. But standing in the flickering light of that night in 1766, as Dr. Deering screamed beneath the tar, liberty looked very much like vengeance. The ritual simplicity made it terrifyingly effective. A pot of tar, a bag of feathers, and a crowd's collective rage. That was all it took to destroy a person. It didn't need judges or gallows. It didn't even need proof, only accusation and fire. As the years passed and the revolution grew, these acts of violence became both celebrated and buried. Textbooks later spoke of the Sons of Liberty, of resistance and independence, but rarely of the men who were stripped, burned, and paraded half-dead through the streets. And yet, beneath the patriotic stories, the truth remains: freedom in America was not born only from noble ideals, but also from pain, fear, and public humiliation. Tar and feathering was not just punishment. It was a mirror of the era's fury, a fury that could just as easily turn inward as outward. In the aftermath of Dr. Deering's ordeal, the tar hardened like armor, but not protection, only imprisonment. For days, he could not move without tearing open wounds that festered beneath the blackened crust. Those who saw him said he wandered alone, covered in rags, unable to bear sunlight or the gaze of his neighbors. The same people who once visited his clinic now crossed the street to avoid him. The punishment had done its job, not just to hurt, but to erase, to take a man's place in society and replace it with shame. And this, above all, was the real power of tarring and feathering. It destroyed identity long before it destroyed flesh. News of the attack spread through colonial papers, carried by whispers and pamphlets that glorified it as a warning to corruption. Some wrote that it was justice. Others, privately, called it barbarity. But no one could ignore it. The sight of Deering's ruined body, the sound of his screams, became part of the local memory, a symbol that fear could enforce order when law seemed powerless. By the late 1760s, similar scenes erupted across the colonies. In Boston, New York, Philadelphia, mobs gathered around cauldrons of tar, their rage boiling hotter than the liquid itself. Tax collectors who enforced the Stamp Act were seized and punished in the same way. Some were coated in burning tar, paraded through town, and forced to swear allegiance to the colonial cause. The act became both punishment and ritual purification, a grotesque cleansing of perceived corruption. But the lines blurred quickly. Anyone could become the next target: a neighbor suspected of collaboration, a merchant accused of greed, a rival whose guilt was convenient. The mob's justice had no rules, no appeal, and no mercy. Once accused, a man's fate hung not on evidence, but on the crowd's hunger for spectacle. Witness accounts describe the ritual and chilling the tale. Buckets of tar, heated until they bubbled and hissed. A victim stripped to the waist, his body trembling under torchlight. The first splash of tar, sometimes cold enough to spare the flesh, other times deliberately scalding, followed by the feathery coating. That turned men into walking effigies. The laughter, the jeers, the songs of defiance, and then the long, humiliating march through the town square. What's most haunting is how quickly it became entertainment. Children watched, tavern owners sold ale to spectators, ministers and magistrates, though horrified, rarely intervened. After all, The violence seemed to serve a purpose, to remind everyone that authority was shifting from kings and courts to the will of the people. Yet beneath the transformation lay a deep irony. The very colonies that demanded freedom from tyranny were creating their own forms of it. In punishing corruption, they were becoming its mirror. In destroying traitors, they were learning how to control through fear. Dr. Deering never spoke publicly again after his torture. He lived, some say, only a few more years, dying quietly and alone. But his name endured, whispered as a cautionary tale even by those who cheered his punishment. And his suffering wasn't unique. Others followed. In 1774, John Malcolm, a customs officer in Boston, was tarred and feathered, then forced to drink boiling tea in mockery of British taxation. He barely survived. His screams echoed through the same streets that would later celebrate independence. Tarring and feathering, once an act of rebellion, soon began to stain the very cause it served. American leaders like Benjamin Franklin publicly condemned it, calling it savage cruelty. But by then, the image was burned into the nation's identity, a raw, painful symbol of how justice, when left to anger, becomes indistinguishable from vengeance. It was never officially outlawed, even in later centuries. Echoes of it resurfaced, not as tar and feathers, but in other forms of public humiliation. Mobs dragging people through streets, branding them, shaming them in the name of morality or revenge. The method evolved, but the intent remained the same: to destroy the human spirit before taking the body. And so when we look back on the tarring and feathering of Dr. Deering, we ray not just witnessing a colonial punishment, we ray seeing a reflection of humanity, that's oldest instinct, to make suffering visible, to turn pain into theater. The molten tar, the feathers, the jeering crowd, they were tools of control, but they were also mirrors, showing how thin the line is between justice and cruelty, between rebellion and tyranny. Dr. Deering's agony was meant to send a message, but in the centuries since, it sends a different one. A warning about what happens when outrage becomes law and when punishment turns into spectacle. Because in that night of screams and fire under the flickering glow of torches, we see not just one man as destruction, but a truth as old as civilization itself. When a society allows humiliation to masquerade as justice, it burns away not only its enemies, but its own humanity. And that lesson, carved into history through tar and pain, still lingers in every era that mistakes vengeance for virtue. If you found this story haunting and eye-opening, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's darkest punishments, forgotten tortures, and the human truths they still reveal. Because history's cruelty was never buried, it's only waiting to be remembered.